I think people are starting to look towards other sources of power beyond our sort of dirtier supplies, and maybe this is it. Maybe this is the big uranium boom everyone's been waiting for.
If you move the emotion out of the market and people begin to look at sources of electricity from a purely rational point of view, there can be no other conclusion other than using nuclear energy.
So to properly decarbonize, you need to take the carbon out of the electricity supply and run those both in parallel. And the fact of the matter is there is no technology that can replace coal for baseload carbon-free electricity except for nuclear.
So good morning, everyone, and I'd like to welcome you all to another Assay Live webinar. This one is looking at the outlook for uranium. So joining us here today, we have Nikos Kakos, President and CEO at Blue Sky Uranium Corp. We have Guy Keller, Commodity Specialist and PM Nuclear Energy Opportunities Fund for Tribeca Investment Partners, and George Ross, Analyst, Metals and Mining Research at Argonaut. So thanks everyone for being here today.
Thanks,
Nice to be here.
Thanks.
And just as a reminder to the audience, we will be taking questions throughout the webinar. Please type them in the Q&A box, not in the chat. It's a bit easier for us to kind of take the questions as they come in if they're in the Q&A. So feel free at any point during the session to write those in there, and we will get to them at an appropriate time during the conversation. So uranium is really set to play a key role in the energy transition, and as such, it's really been gaining ground as global institutions and governments make decisions on what a decarbonized future energy system is going to look like. So I thought that we can start off this discussion today looking at what is the current supply and demand scenario, and how is this impacted by the pandemic, and where are we in terms of recovery? Guy, maybe you'd like to kick us off there.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks for having me here today. It's been a pleasure to join you all. I mean, quite simply, there's a primary mine supply deficit, and whichever way you cut it, there's a deficit. And when you look at other sources that have traditionally filled that, it still does not fill the deficit, which means you have an inventory draw. And we model that deficit out to at least 2025. The great thing about the supply-demand fundamentals of this sector is, even if there was no more nuclear reactors ever built, based on what's currently consuming uranium, that deficit still exists. So whilst we've seen a price appreciation on the spot market, that doesn't necessarily mean that any of these other hopeful developers will come to market at this price, because there's a whole bunch of other factors, including contracting and permitting jurisdiction, a whole bunch of things that need to go right for that supply to even come. And even when that comes, we still don't think it fills that deficit.
No, I agree.
Sorry, go ahead.
If I could add to that, I think that and that deficit sits at is what's been projected. And there's a lot of factors that could influence that projection. For example, what's not factored in there are restarting the Japanese reactors. France is rethinking its nuclear power plant terminations and extending the lifespan, the same happening in the United States. These are all factors, I think, that if all of them, but even if one of them were to come into play, I think it would have a tremendous effect in exaggerating the deficit that we're talking about.
And then we had earlier this week, we had the Chinese talking about building 150 new reactors over the next 15 years, which is just an extraordinary number of reactors if it came to be. So I think we're sort of getting to a bit of a tipping point in the uranium and nuclear industries in general. I think people are starting to look towards other sources of power beyond our sort of dirtier supplies, and maybe this is it. Maybe this is the big uranium boom everyone's been waiting for.
How do you see kind of these deficits impacting pricing?
I think we've seen it already, the beginnings of it anyways. I first noticed that there's something going on with our company when we were trying to raise some money between Christmas and New Year. And then we got such an incoming slot of investors trying to get in. I couldn't fit everybody in. We had to grow the size of our financing. And I talked to my investor relations chap, and I said, well, what's going on? What's happening here? This has never happened in the uranium sector before. So definitely this is something new. And I think we're in the beginnings of a new, looks like we're in a new uranium bull cycle here that looks like it may have legs different than before, because you know, even with the environmental talks that are happening now in Scotland, you're hearing more and more about nuclear electricity generated by nuclear power, that it's becoming more and more accepted worldwide. And I think there's a acceptance that the new reactors being built are safer, and the world definitely needs, you know, safe, secure, and reliable, and relatively carbon-free energy. And I think more and more are realizing this is the best way to go about it.
I think, sorry, Amy, I think one of the great things for bulls in this market is that the World Nuclear Association, they do a report every 2 years. And whilst they increase their demand in the latest 2021 report, they ignore the technological advances of small modular reactors. So they don't even look at that demand. And as I said, when you've got a deficit on the existing fleet, you're in the middle of the biggest reactor build program at the moment that we've seen in decades, with over a dozen countries building sort of 50 odd reactors. Then you have the Chinese news as to their ambitions, and we've got this great unknown of small modular reactors. You know, overnight, Rolls-Royce in the UK raised some money to allow them to then tap into government funding to expand their program. They're already talking about sites in the mid and the north of the UK to put those small modular reactors and connect them in the early 2030s. And people often say to me, you know, if it's such an obvious trade, why is it not playing out with respect to the one buyer being utilities coming to the market? And I think what you have to remember is, this is not like an iron ore trade where there's thousands of steel mills competing for iron ore cargoes. You know, there's a small number, relatively small number of buyers being utilities, and nuclear is only a part of what they do. You know, most of the, with the exception probably France, in the United States, they're running coal, they're running gas. They've seen their power inputs triple in the last few months as we enter probably one of the biggest energy crises that we've seen since the 1970s. And a nuclear engineer is coming to them and saying, maybe we should lock down some uranium supply for 10 years from 2024 when we get a bit light. And the board of these big utilities, you know, they look at that and say that's 6 to 8% of the cost of running your nuclear plants. We've got a problem here because 85% of our cost of running coal and gas is suddenly gone up 3 times. We need to solve this first. So it will come, but you just have to appreciate that utilities don't move in a hurry. The one thing that we do know from the past is when they do move, they move in lockstep, and they're decisive in what they do, and that's when the market really properly takes off.
Interesting. Yeah, my kind of, I had a question later on looking at kind of the role of these small modular reactors, and do any of our other panelists want to comment on kind of where they see that role in the uranium space playing out?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, small modular reactors are an amazing concept because you can basically pick up a power plant, is what they're talking about, a very small footprint power plant, and installing them in remote locations. The design of the modular reactors is sort of being put together so that it's a very standardized design. They're going to be relatively affordable to produce and require very little maintenance. And I guess that's the real plus, because you can pick these up and put them into locations that are quite remote. So, for example, a stranded mineral deposit, which is 1,000 kilometres from any major power source, stick it there, and then that will run the operation for the life of mine, hopefully, depending on how long it's there. So I think that's an incredible opportunity for the nuclear industry to duck into, and something that we will see unfold in the not too distant future. Already the Russians are, they have a small nuclear reactor operating on a boat up in the Arctic Sea. And obviously we do see smaller scale reactors in submarines and ships in the military sort of space throughout the world. So yeah, very interesting. And I just did want to touch on on uranium pricing and how that affects sort of, I know Guy touched on it as well, I guess the overall operating costs of nuclear energy. So it's pretty amazing. If you double the price of raw uranium, so if you go from $25 to $50, that only adds an extra, I think, 10% of the operating cost. Is that correct, Guy? You'd probably be more across that than me. I think it's, which is, so the nuclear industry is able to, or the production industry, the energy production industry is able to absorb a lot of that increase in uranium pricing, sort of much better than I guess some of the other industries out there like coal, where it has a material effect on the cost of energy production. So yeah.
I think the problem that comes is that you don't necessarily have the proportional increase in supply as easily as you can raise the price. And that's what creates the price increase to begin with.
Yeah.
I mean, there's only 10 countries in the world that actually produce pretty well 100% of the world's uranium right now.
Yeah. And it's far more important for the industry as a whole to have a reliable supply of uranium fuel than to worry about, a small price increase for their business. For them, they want the assurance of supply. And it can't come from one country, one company. It has to come from multiple different sources, because that provides a bit of assurance that and insurance that it will be there.
And Nico started to earlier mention about the investment, at least coming into Blue Sky. Where is this sort of investment? Where do you see the investment coming from? And I suppose how does regulatory support start to factor into the kind of growth in the industry or interest?
I think for the first time in a long time, we saw institutional interest in investing in uranium. I think a lot of funds were seeing that, we're seeing what we're talking about tonight, that or this morning, sorry, I'm talking about my time zone here. We're seeing that the price of uranium was about to uptick, and they were beginning to place their bets fairly early, and those are the first real indicators that I felt that, okay, where this is a real solid move here. Smart money basically is making this decision. And then following that, we're seeing just a whole swath of retail investors chasing it. And we're seeing the volumes in our everyday stock pricing beginning to ticker up, and just a love for uranium. And there's not that many companies that you can invest in. It's not 15 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, the last uranium boom, I think on a Toronto Stock Exchange, you had 500-600 companies that were in the uranium business, but now there's less than 30. So the number of investments that you can actually make has shrunk dramatically.
And I suppose, Guy, bringing you in here as an investor, where are you guys seeing opportunities? Yeah.
Well, I just want to correct Nico. The smart money started investing about 3 years ago, but there's still relatively smart money.
Real smart money.
To Nico's point, I mean, you've got a bunch of companies, a market capitalization that fits inside of Fortescue or Freeport, and those companies are responsible for providing the raw material input that generates 10% of the world's electricity. I mean, it's just extraordinary how small and undervalued the sector is. And when you look at price moves in September, for example, that was a little bit spurred on by some of this sort of social media platform activity. It just shows how small that doorway is to get that exposure. And when you look through the cycle, the bits in the middle from uranium to fuel are not very investable, and then the utilities I've mentioned before are very diversified, so you can't really get that exposure. It has to be at the uranium mining. And the opportunity now comes at looking back at history. To Nico's point, the last bull market, there was a lot of investment opportunities that are not currently there, which means that there's a lot of potential projects out there that may come to market soon. And, you know, from that last bull market, there are some very good properties that didn't make it because the timing of the cycle prohibited that. And, you know, whilst you will see some of that moose pasture sort of run out again to the market to try to look for a quick return, there are some quality assets out there. We're certainly keeping an eye on them and talking to people that we think may be responsible to bring them back to market. And as well, I mean, as broader interest gets into the sector, a good diversified cross-section of stocks at the moment works well for you because that money needs to find a home.
Okay, so we've had a question come in for Guy. When looking at investment opportunities, are you jurisdiction sensitive given the issues around uranium and the politics that go with it?
Yeah, look, jurisdiction, I mean, you have to start with an ore body. As mining specialists, and George as a geologist will attest to this as well. You know, you need to make sure that what you're looking at has the right signals to be exploited with respect to drilling or what have you. The jurisdiction, you know, ordinarily jurisdiction is important for us in our global natural resources business. The uranium story means that jurisdictions that you may avoid for other commodities, because that commodity is mined in better jurisdictions potentially, you don't necessarily have that choice. But when it comes to those jurisdictions, there's a number of those countries, you know, especially in Africa, where the French have been there for 40 or 50 odd years mining these ore bodies without any problems. So, you know, when you look at that, because of the fact that there's less jurisdictions, we're not as agnostic on that. We get more worried about permitting and community. So some of the better jurisdictions on paper turn out to have a few more skeletons in the closet when it turns out when it turns around to litigious groups or bureaucratic process with respect to getting, you know, numerous permits. So you might look at that and say this is in a great jurisdiction and come unstuck due to a whole bunch of other things because it's uranium.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, from my perspective is ideally you want to be in a jurisdiction that has had previous uranium mining. I think that's probably one of the key things going into a, you know, sort of greenfields jurisdiction of no uranium mining, I think does carry a bit more risk. And there's plenty of, you know, provinces worldwide, Saskatchewan, obviously South Australia with Beverley and Honeymoon coming online in the embayment there. In my mind, you do want to be somewhere where it has occurred previously. And as far as investments, that's just my view. And yeah,
Australia's a perfect example, as you were saying. You look at Australia and go, great uranium resource, most of it's Olympic Dam. Great country to mine. You can't mine or explore in Western Australia or Queensland because of policy, not legislation, policy. Some politician has decided they don't want to do it when 99% of the people in those states don't care or don't know that that's policy.
And as a geo who previously worked in the uranium industry in Queensland, when it was on again, off again for exploration and mining, I mean, what an absolute nightmare! Queensland has basically burnt all of the uranium explorers out there, who I really think you would struggle to get anyone to go up there and explore for uranium again these days, even if they did repeal things back a bit because of the changes to regs over the years and policy. Yeah. And I guess for me, the other thing is looking at, your capital intensity of as far as an investment proposition. So the life of mine, how much it's going to cost to actually get it up and running compared to the production that you're getting per annum, and then ultimately the cost of production as well. Because if you can get your mine paid off, the big winners in the long run are always going to be those operators with low cost of production and low risk across the board.
No, I mean, I agree with that. If I can add to that, I mean, like I said earlier, there's only a few countries in the world that really produce uranium. So when the demand for uranium is so high, you can't really be choosers. I mean, Canada, US, Australia produce really just about a quarter of the world's uranium. Most of the uranium in the world comes from jurisdictions like Kazakhstan and some African countries and Russia. That some of us may feel that that's not the most advantageous, the most secure way to obtain a vital commodity like uranium. So there are new jurisdictions that could emerge, perhaps. I know we're working on a new district in Argentina, for example, which is a nuclear country, by the way, with a fully operating nuclear environment. But that being said, I think jurisdiction is an issue that could potentially exacerbate the uranium supply situation from a strategic point, from political angles, I think, in the future, if this becomes really tight. Very much like we're seeing with gas from Russia coming into Europe.
Mm.
Yeah. Diversity of supply is always fantastic, however you get it.
So there's been a question that has come in. It's specifically for Nico, though I believe our other panelists should be able to weigh in as well. So it says there's plenty of equity interest in uranium, but on the debt side, are banks looking to finance uranium projects? Do they need something like a positive development on the EU Green Taxonomy before they'll look to support the junior space?
Well, we're out of junior space. We're not quite at that point right now where we're looking for bankable money. I don't know. I'd like to punt that question off the guy or Ross here, if he can provide us some answer.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's no doubt that there has been banking expertise lost in uranium in the last 10 years because there's been nothing to bank. Mm-hmm. I don't think that certainly in Canada, France, I mean, you still do have that resource tilt. France is obviously a nuclear country and has supported their sort of state industries or semi-state industries by those sorts of facilities. When it comes to the EU taxonomy, certainly, I mean, France is pushing very hard for that to be included for the simple fact that they're wanting to approve 6 mega reactors, 1.6 gigawatt reactors. And under an EU Green Taxonomy, that brings down the cost of financing because it opens a whole bunch of avenues. When we look at banks financing, I mean, I think those that we see are ready to come to market are held back on the basis of price and contract. And most banks will want some sort of price security, and certainly as equity holders, we don't necessarily want prospective producers with zero price protection, but at the same time, we don't want them to give away all of their upside. So there is a dance that's being had at the moment, but I see as utilities come towards getting closer to contracting, I think bank discussions happen. But also you've got very cheap money, so there's a lot of sort of private equity out there. There's other avenues when you look at the motor industry with respect to electric vehicles and battery technology. You know, a lot of these battery makers and car makers are entering into finance agreements with lithium miners and cobalt miners and nickel projects in order to secure that supply. So whilst that's probably a learning curve for the utilities to engage in that, I don't discount that happening, because, you know, these are large multi-billion-dollar utilities that do have a level of expertise in what they do, and so when presented with that sort of option, they may seriously look at it, but they don't need to at the moment. So as I said, I'm not that worried about financing, but I think there's still a few steps that need to happen before we see too much of it happening.
So bringing the conversation around to kind of the energy transition and decarbonization, what do you see as nuclear's role in the energy transition moving forward? Is it an ideal fuel source? What makes it so? Let's get into the details about uranium a little bit more.
Might start off on that one if you like, Amy. Yeah. Look, I think it's an excellent fuel source. It's one of the very few fuel options that we have that is, you know, more or less zero carbon emission, or very low carbon emission for that matter. Obviously, there is generally a large capital upfront cost to nuclear power plants. However, if you look at the levelized cost of, you know, generating the electricity over the life of these power plants, it's actually very competitive with other options out there. I think in a lot of instances, it provides an option to countries where perhaps renewable can't be depended on, you know, whether it's solar or wind for that matter. So it is a good option for baseload power. Obviously, you know, it's not completely flawless. There is the conversation that we have to have about, you know, waste and how we manage that. In my mind, I think it's important that well-developed countries sort of take a lead there, and I don't think we're perhaps doing enough just yet. I know the Finns are currently building a fairly significant waste disposal storage facility themselves, but, you know, I think the likes of Canada, the US and Australia probably need to do a bit more in that space. You know, we want to be able to use uranium as a fuel source, but at the end of the day, we have to deal with the dirty little secret with what you're left with at the end. And the only way to do that is to do, you know, high-tech, you know, well-developed storage facilities. And I have to say, if you can get over the, you know, the stigma with it, if you do it properly in a stable geological environment, there's actually a massive opportunity there financially for those countries involved, but they need to be courageous enough to actually make the investment and move forward with that.
Yeah, look,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say on the waste, I don't view that as problematic, because the reality is that spent fuel rods still have a commercial and energy value. When you look at France, you know, they reprocess sort of 70% of their spent fuel rods, and the only thing really holding it back is that there's a cost to it. So, you know, when you had $16 uranium, obviously it was cheaper to go and buy the uranium and put it through the process for new fuel rods. And so when you look at the storage that happens at the moment, and I agree, longer term, as those fuel rods go through a number of cycles and lose their value, there needs to be a solution. But we've been storing it successfully for 60 years without incident, 60 plus years without incident. And the reason that there's not the big political push to shove it all underground is because there's still a value in it. You know, if you see uranium go to $200 and the whole rest of the processing cycle do the same, you will find a lot of that spent fuel is coming back to reprocessed purely because it has to, and it's needed to. I think the other thing to point out is that nuclear energy on the civilian side is the only industry in the world where waste is dealt with financially at the time of before it's even a reactor's even constructed. So when that whole project finance is done, there is an amount set aside at the beginning before any concrete is poured to deal with waste. It's the only industry in the world that does that. I mean, it's incredible to think of that, and the reason why is because there's a lot of stigma and emotion involved in it. So the industry has to be best practice, you know, and I would love to see other industries that are heavy polluters, you know, plastics and what have you, trying to take a similar approach, but it's a massive problem that they've got.
Well, I would agree with that. I mean, and the nature of the kind of pollution, this waste, is important too, because while it over time it's radioactive, it will decay. You know, whether it's 100 years to 200 years, whatever that time frame, if you store it safely enough, it will decay. The problem will go away eventually. But if you look at, take solar panels, for example, solar panels contain a lot of highly toxic rare earths and rare elements in there that never decay. These are now concentrated, and when a solar panel ages and it's discarded, it's buried somewhere, and it's toxic waste that's toxic for life until somebody actually picks it up and decides, okay, we have to treat this and do something with it. Yeah. So that's a part of the conversation we don't often hear too often about. So there's different aspects of the quality and the kind of waste.
And I think, just coming back to Amy's sort of original point, when you look at the capacity factor, you know, everyone wants to talk about technology. Technology is going to catch up. We've got technology in nuclear that has been through a huge amount of change in 60 years to make itself, you know, extremely safe. And we've got a new technology that's proven that it can be put towards commercial, which is the small modular reactors. And you think about it, you replace a 1 gigawatt coal-fired power plant, you replace that with a 1 gigawatt nuclear plant, you're getting more electricity than you are in the coal because it runs more. To replace that 1 gigawatt of coal with solar, you've got to put 3 gigawatts in, plus
the batteries.
And then you've got to put some battery storage in, which means you've probably got to put 5 or 6 gigawatts in, because the battery is only able to charge when the sun's shining. The electricity that's generated from the 3 gigs you've got there is being used, so you need to have more to charge the battery. And then you've got to go and triple your transmission capability, because the power lines that went from the coal station are capable of moving that equivalent of what's coming out of 1 gigawatt. You suddenly got 3 gigawatts wanting to try to push it all through. I mean, so the changes are extraordinary, and the whole idea that the battery technology will catch up, where is the investment money coming from in grid scale technology? You know, in cars, there's hundreds of millions of dollars going into R&D and into electric vehicle batteries. It's a different type of battery for grid scale. In mobile telephones, you remember the big old bricks that they used to have years ago, and now things you can sit in your pocket, doing 1 million times more computing than they were. Billions of dollars has gone into that development, and everyone's just assuming that on the grid that the batteries are just going to turn up, and that, you know, that we'll just adapt the current technology. No, there needs to be, and nobody's putting that money in. So the technology is there to replace baseload electricity that pollutes with baseload electricity that does not pollute, which means you can turn your lights on at night.
Absolutely, and it's a very efficient way of doing it. I think I'd read a note in a book not that long ago, and it said that if you take an oil barrel and fill it only halfway up with uranium, that's about all the energy that a single human needs to live there, to represent the amount of energy a human needs for their entire lifespan. So it's a very, very efficient way to, you know, to generate electricity. Whereas, you know, whether you have windmills or whether you have solar panels, look at these vast areas, the footprints, the land footprints in the environment that they destroy. I mean, that's often not discussed either. So there are trade-offs, and you know, this is what makes nuclear acceptable. I think the big problem with nuclear is the stigma that came out of it in the 50s, and we're still shedding that. And I think young people today are beginning to realize that it's the logical way to begin to go forward. And as that gains acceptance, we're seeing, more and more reactors getting built around the world.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the follow-up is really how do we get past that stigma? Whose responsibility, or who's educating the broader society about the benefits of nuclear?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think anyone who hears anything from any nuclear energy associated organisation initially, or immediately sort of pushes back, fairly cynical passion. I mean, I think ultimately probably it's going to have to be governments that take the lead to try and push it upon people that it is a good solution. It is a decarbonising solution that is existing technology that has been improved, that is increasingly safe. I think there's a bit of a detachment with reality, this just innate fear that people have about the nuclear energy industry because they don't understand radiation. All they know is they can't see it, they can't smell it, they can't hear it, yet it can kill them. And I think that's this innate thing that they have in their head. I was just reading earlier, I just wanted to check my facts, but Chernobyl, there are 134 workers and emergency responders, diagnosed with acute radiation. 28 died within weeks. US firearms deaths last year, in 2019, were 39,000. So you kind of look at it, you go, well, because for me, there's just this innate fear that people have that isn't with reality. They go, nuclear energy, oh, that's the same as bombs, and it's just not. It's just not. If we said that the same about nickel, or that's made to used to make guns, or anything else that's made for other purposes that is used to kill, then I don't think you'd have a problem with nuclear. But I just find that astounding that those kind of figures when you look at how safe it is, and if you look at the actual number of deaths from nuclear energy versus other energy forms, it's right down there. For life cycle, so that's deaths included with the mining of say coal, for example, and also the downstream deaths from pollution made from coal, greatly outnumbers what happens with nuclear energy. It's quite extraordinary. It is a safe energy. It is a safe source of energy, but the public doesn't see it that way.
I kind of think that the government played a role in generating this stigma for nuclear energy as a dangerous place, because in the 50s in the US, the government, the organization that was responsible for educating the public was really like an offshoot of the military branch, and they were actually spewing propaganda. And I think that's what really started the cynicism as people started to see it. You go to Russia, you see what happened in Chernobyl. A lot of that was regulatory, and it was the government that not managing safety procedures well. I think having an independent agency that can sort of be independent of political manipulation and be able to talk about the safety issues and like the IAE or whatever, I think that might be a more effective way in terms of educating it. I think the World Nuclear Association is doing a good job, but I think there's a lot of prejudice there already, and in a lot of people's minds that needs to be overcome. But I think over time, as things are demonstrated that nuclear energy is indeed safe, I think it'll become more and more accepted.
I think to your point, Amy, social media. I mean, the age brackets of everybody, with all the surveys as to people who are in favour of nuclear energy, it's overwhelmingly the younger generations, because the older generations have still got the stigma associated with drills and hiding under their desks in schools. And you're seeing that more and more. There's a lot more presence in social media from younger people taking a stance, as well as some high profile anti-nuclear, Michael Schellenberger over in the US, that person from Zion Lights more recently come out in favour. Down here, there's been some anti-nuclear environmentalists who've done the whole 180. And I think as people see that, and they're active in social media as well, people see that and go, wait, hang on. These people spent how many years campaigning against it, now are in support of it. What's changed here? As well as government policies. You've seen the United States Democratic administration become pro-nuclear. France is driving Europe to be nuclear tolerant at the least, and Japan sentiment, South Korea sentiment, they're all turning around. And part of that, I think, is also driven by the energy crisis that's happening right now. You've got these energy hungry countries looking at coal and gas prices through the roof, and whether they're being held hostage or whether it's proper tightness, and saying, what's the solution? Oh, wow, we've got some nuclear reactors sitting here turned off that maybe we should turn them back on again. So I think, it is, you Google nuclear and green and nuclear 4 years ago, you had, zero. Now, mainstream media are writing articles about it almost every second day.
That's true.
So we've got this has generated quite a few questions from the audience. So I think we'll just kind of run through those now. Following on from that, should France be a bigger booster of nuclear, since it consists of 70% of its energy, and they also have the credibility from the Paris Accord?
Should they be a bigger what, sorry?
Should they be a bigger booster for the nuclear?
I mean, I've got France. I had France sort of net negative demand 4 years ago, moved to sort of neutral. The beginning of this year, they finally got the approval for the life extension of 32 of their reactors for another 10 years, and they want to put another 6 multi-gigawatt reactors in place. So they're certainly net positive demand now. Plus they're driving Europe, and other countries are looking at them sort of saying, well, maybe we don't retire the reactors, probably with the exception of Germany, because
I was going to say Germany must be scratching their heads.
Yeah. But, I mean, it wasn't that long ago that France was wanting nuclear to be reduced to 50% of their electricity output, and they've backflipped there and said, no, it's 70 and maybe more. And as small modular reactors come through, I mean, they are big reactor builders with that's a massive industry for them. So don't be surprised to see them jumping on a technology there and pushing that out aggressively as well.
I mean, I think the complete antithesis to that is what happened in Germany. Germany switched off all their nuclear reactors, and they started firing up all their lignite coal mines, which is absolutely the dirtiest type of coal burning that could be there. Their pollution has gone up like, 20 or 30%. And now, I've been reading in the mainstream media that there's discussions about maybe we should be turning these reactors back on.
Yeah, and I think this discussion will probably only intensify as we go sort of deeper into the Northern Hemisphere winter as well. So, we're already seeing issues with energy on all continents. So I think it's just going to come to the forefront of discussion.
And I suppose shifting a little bit, what is the appetite for pure uranium exploration plays? Given there's been very few genuine new tier 1 discovery, certainly in Australia, even in the last uranium boom. Are we on the cusp of a uranium exploration boom, but with very few geologists that know how to find it?
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. I was involved in the last uranium run, and I think we are going to begin to see a lot more uranium exploration in Australia. The money is in the market. You just have to have a look at the number of IPOs going on across, not just in the uranium space, but across the board on the ASX. It's been quite extraordinary this year. And correct, there haven't been many sort of major uranium discoveries in quite a while in Australia. There have been a few in Canada, up in sort of, the Athabasca Basin. And some of the companies are up there are just, have quite incredible sort of market capitalizations. I know there's ISO Energy, which I believe is on the TSX. I think it's over 650 million Australian equivalent dollars at the moment. So there's definitely appetite out there from investors, from the investor space. That said, there are a lot of undeveloped uranium deposits out there globally. It's just you need the right price to make them worthwhile developing. So as far as the geos go, look, a good geologist is going to be ultimately be able to find any sort of deposit. I don't know how many good geologists are left out there. Oh, there's plenty, don't worry. Yeah, I mean, uranium is a bit tricky to find. There's various different kinds of uranium deposits. Guy mentioned earlier that Olympic Dam is a huge uranium deposit. It's what's called an IOCG, which is an iron oxide copper gold style, whereas Beverly and Honeymoon are sort of more channel hosted. So there's plenty of opportunity in Australia for both those styles and elsewhere in the world. So no doubt we'll start to see a bit of a switch. We've obviously had a bit of a run with, I guess, lithium players in Australia, lithium explorers. I expect we're probably going to start to deal into more uranium explorers now in the market. And I expect their heads will start popping up, perhaps as spin-outs out of existing companies in the near future.
Well, I can talk to this from an exploration play because that's what I do. And in the last decade, when trying to ask people to invest in an exploration play in Argentina, it was very difficult. In fact, I got a few laughs, and as a result, I ended up myself and management own a larger proportion of the company than we initially set out. But with more money, though, we are able now to accelerate our programs. We're able to intensify our exploration efforts. We have there is a dearth of good uranium exploration geologists. I'm happy to say that we have a good one in Argentina where we operate, and we work with the university, whereby university graduates in the geology department, we're training them in the uranium exploration, and then they come to work for us afterwards. And Argentina, it looks like it's emerging. We have, it has the potential to have a big uranium discovery here that with some very low costs, very similar to what we're seeing in Kazakhstan. So there are some new trends. They're difficult to find, but they do exist. And I think, like with Blue Sky, what we're doing in Argentina, I think is a testament to, these kinds of markets that can generate some big new discoveries that can perhaps begin to serve the demand that we're seeing.
And so we are kind of coming up to the end of the hour. I think we can maybe just address this one final question from the audience and wrap it up there. So somebody is asking if we can discuss the capital cost and operating cost when comparing nuclear versus coal versus green alternatives. Big question.
Yeah, well, I might chime in there just a little bit. I'm sure Guy's got plenty to say as well. Capital costs pretty high up front, generally speaking, compared to a lot of options out there, whether it's coal or renewables. I put out some research recently. I'm just trying to find it here so I can give you some absolute numbers. I don't have it here in front of me, unfortunately. Yeah, look, relatively high upfront costs, but one of the, you have to look beyond just the upfront costs. Yes, you look at the operating costs as well, and you look at the lifespan of the actual producing asset. That's really important because the longer something is producing, basically the lower capital intensity you have initially. And one of the really nice things about nuclear reactors is that you can recommission them. And so you get to a point in the life of the reactor, which you can then basically strip out and replace part of the components core. And after that point, you can continue producing electricity. And it's those kind of situations that make nuclear very competitive on a full lifetime cost of electricity. And yeah, I guess that sort of answers you. I haven't got exact numbers in front of me that I can quote, but Guy, perhaps, or Nico, either of you have?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're from the reactor point of view, we're seeing that happening in the U.S., where the reactors initially were set up to have 50-year lifespan. They're being extended to 80, sometimes even up to 100 years, which is absolutely incredible. If you think we're still using last century's technology to generate electricity, that and it goes through all the safety checks and whatnot. So I think that's really quite incredible. But then you have to look all the way from the beginning, like even producing the uranium, producing the oil, and producing, and it's hard to compare, I guess, because not all, even within the uranium space, not all deposits are the same. Some are, you go to Athabasca and they're buried, 2, 3, 4 kilometers in frozen ground under a lake. The cost for extracting that uranium is quite different than, say, extracting it like what we have in Argentina, which is in the first 30 meters from surface in an unconsolidated material. So it becomes apples and oranges, but on averages, I think what's missing, of course, is the environmental cost and the cleanup cost, and that's a factor that's not in there. And it's a factor that should be in there, because we're all looking to begin paying that now, through various kinds of taxes and other indirect costs.
Amy, I don't know, am I able to share a screen?
Yes. Yeah. So at the bottom, there's a green button that says share screen.
So I'll just share this with the audience. So this is basically what I was speaking about earlier, which is what's called the levelized cost of electricity. And what you can see, so what this is it's basically looking at the cost of producing electricity with as much cost as you can build into the life cycle, I guess, of that generation. So that's capital costs, it's operating costs over the life. It also uses, I think, $13 per ton carbon emission tax. So it's an NPV model which uses a 7% discount rate. And the idea is that you can then try and compare different styles of power generation, across the market. So this is nuclear, and that's what the brown line there represents, the mean sort of average cost, US dollars per megawatt hour. And it sort of comes in around that, around 60. If you compare that with fossil fuel technologies, so lignite or coal, for example, we were speaking about earlier, because of the carbon emissions that are generated, if you put a $30 per ton cost on that, they're actually more expensive over the life. Nuclear is, comparable very much at the utility scale for solar PV, and is cheaper than most other forms. Looking at this is again the life cycle cost. But what's really interesting is this little one down here, which is nuclear LTO, which is basically recommissioning nuclear reactors. Once you start to recommission reactors, the cost drops off, and it's actually cheaper than any other source of electricity out there, because you've already got the asset there. You maybe plow in another $1 billion or whatever to recommission the reactor, but at the end of the day, you're basically using that existing asset. You don't need to replace it for the most part. So you actually come in at the cheapest of all energy sources, which is quite extraordinary. Yeah,
great chart.
Yeah, that's an IEA, so International Energy Agency chart in one of their 2020 publications. And I recommend that if you are interested in looking up information on nuclear energy and uranium, for that matter, it's a fantastic source.
Great, thank you for that. I suppose, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Guy.
We've got probably time for one more, surely.
Yeah. I was just going to ask if anyone had final thoughts, starting with you.
Even better. Yeah, I mean, it's this opportunity is unique. You know, when we look top down at every commodity that we cover as part of our global natural resources business, this flags as by far the most dislocated on a supply-demand fundamentals, both short and longer term. When I look at what's different to the last market cycles, you've got China in a big reactor build program. You've got the rest of the world following. You've got a race to the next technology for nuclear technology, and you've got governments focusing on how to decarbonize. And the two big themes we have two of the big themes we have in our global natural resources business is decarbonisation, electrification. What people don't understand is that you can't, if you're just electrifying in the current market, you're not decarbonising, because whilst you might be running around in a green vehicle, you're plugging that into coal-fired generation. So you're not decarbonising, you're just moving the carbon somewhere else. So to properly decarbonise, you need to take the carbon out of the electricity supply and run those both in parallel. And the fact of the matter is there is no technology that can replace coal for baseload carbon-free electricity except for nuclear. And so the sooner the world embraces that, the better. And as we've seen on some charts there, the fallacies that it's expensive, it's larger capex compared to other sources, that chart proves are incorrect. It's competitive, and it's got more competitive, and it will continue to get competitive, because what the Koreans, for example, have shown us is the more you build these things, and the Chinese, the better they get at them, the quicker they are at doing them, and the more expertise is retained in how to, and make it more modularized, more standardized, so it's the same every single time. As for where the price of uranium can go, it would surprise me if we don't look at 2007 bull market levels. Does it stay up there? The answer is I don't know. But the reality is the contract price needs to be much higher to bring supply to the market that's not necessarily going to be able to fulfill the supply deficit. In 2007, we had 30 projects that were going to come to market between 7 and 12. 7 of them made it. So, anybody looking at that WNA supply chart saying, look at all that prospective supply that's going to come on, I can tell you, being a long time in mining investments, that even in the honeymoon scenarios and the best scenarios ever, not everything comes to market, because there's a whole bunch of other things except for price. So, whilst there's short-term noise in this market, longer term, you have to be bullish this sector, because it is the beginning of a multi-decade bull market.
No, I agree. I think the only real barrier that remains is it's the emotion barrier. If you move the emotion out of the market and people begin to look at sources of electricity from a purely rational point of view, there can be no other conclusion other than using nuclear energy.
George, any final thoughts?
No, look, I do agree with the other guys. My view is certainly in the short to medium term, we are going to see much higher prices in the market. There's powers at play like the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust, that are on market buying incredible amounts of spot market material, which I believe is sort of distorting the market at the moment in the short term. But I believe the long-term fundamentals will support high uranium prices in general. And I'm sort of looking the 60, 65 for contract pricing that I think a lot of the potential producers might lock in. But at the end of the day, we need, or the nuclear energy industry needs these sources to come online, because they will start to taper off, and that will start to mess with energy supply. And as we've seen in the past few weeks, where energy shortages aren't very popular with anyone out there.
Absolutely. All right. Well, that really brings us to the end of the hour. I think that was a really great discussion about the future for the industry. So I want to thank all of our panelists for taking part today. We will have the replay link available in the next couple of days, and that will be sent out. If anyone wants to have another listen. And we look forward to seeing everyone at an in-person event in the not too distant future. So thanks, everyone.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.